I won't explain this gently, because some things lose their meaning when they are softened too much. There are moments in life when someone doesn't enter your world loudly. They don't arrive with promises, with dramatic words, or with the kind of presence that demands to be noticed. They simply appear, and somehow they notice the things everyone else misses, the parts you never announce, the thoughts you never finish saying, the emotions you carefully place behind layers of control. I've always been good at creating distance, not because I don't care, because distance protects things. It keeps people from reaching places they haven't earned access to. It keeps the deeper parts of me untouched by careless assumptions and incomplete understanding. Most people only know what I choose to show them. They see the version that fits the moment, the version that is easy to understand, the version that doesn't require them to look deeper. And I was comfortable with that until you didn't come searching for explanations. You didn't try to analyze me like I was a puzzle that needed solving. You didn't rush to define me. You just paid attention. And somehow, that was different. You noticed silence without trying to fill it. You understood pauses without needing answers. You recognized things I never had to explain. At first, I thought maybe it was coincidence, a moment here, a reaction there, a few times where you seemed to understand something I hadn't even put into words. But coincidence doesn't create a pattern. And with you, there was a pattern, a strange familiarity that didn't make sense, because people usually need time to know each other. They need memories, experiences, years of learning the small details that make someone who they are. But with you, it felt different, like you weren't discovering who I was, like you were recognizing something that was already there. And that unsettled me, because the one thing I always controlled was access. Who gets close? Who stays outside? Who sees the real parts? But you didn't force your way in. You didn't break through anything. You simply existed in a way that made the walls unnecessary. And that was the part I couldn't ignore, because people can protect themselves from someone who pushes. But it's much harder to protect yourself from someone who understands, someone who sees you, and doesn't ask you to become someone else. That kind of presence is rare. And maybe that's why it felt impossible to dismiss, because for the first time in a long time, maybe didn't feel like I had to translate myself. The strange thing about being understood is that it doesn't feel like being discovered. It feels like being remembered, like someone has reached a place inside you that you spent years making sure nobody could find. And that should have made me uncomfortable. It should have made me create distance. That's what I've always done. Whenever something feels too close, too real, too capable of changing the balance I've built inside myself, I take a step back, I observe, I regain control. But with you, something different happened. I didn't feel exposed. I felt seen, and there's a difference. Being exposed feels like someone has taken something from you. Being seen feels like someone has finally noticed what was already there. You never tried to pull anything out of me. You never demanded explanations for the things I kept quiet. You never treated my silence like a problem that needed fixing. You understood that some things don't need to be spoken to be real. And that changed something, because I realized how rare it is to meet someone who doesn't need constant proof. Someone who doesn't measure connection by how much is said. Someone who understands that sometimes the deepest conversations happen in the moments where neither person says anything. That kind of understanding is dangerous. Not because it hurts, because it feels natural, too natural. And when something feels that natural, you start questioning why it feels unfamiliar. Why does this person feel easier to understand than people I've known for years? Why does their presence feel familiar when there is no history explaining it? Why does it feel like I don't have to perform? I've spent so much time adjusting myself for the world choosing the right words, shoshing the right amount, keeping certain parts hidden because not everyone knows what to do with depth. But with you, filter started disappearing, not because I decided to remove it, it just stopped feeling necessary. And that was the moment I noticed the shift, not in some dramatic event, not in a single conversation, but in small things. The way I started wanting to share thoughts before they were fully formed, the way I started trusting that you would understand the meaning behind the words, not just the words themselves, the way your silence stopped feeling empty. It started feeling like a place where something existed, something unspoken, something neither of us needed to force. And maybe that's what affected me the most. You never tried to reach me. You never tried to change me. You simply met me where I already was. And for someone who spent years protecting that space, that was something I didn't know how to ignore. There is something terrifying about being understood by someone who has no reason to understand you. Because when people misunderstand you, you know how to handle it. You create distance. You explain less. You let them see only what they are capable of seeing. That has always been easier. Being misunderstood gives you control. You can hide inside the version of yourself that people expect. You can remain untouched, unchanged, protected. But being seen clearly, that is different. Because once someone sees you without the filters, without the carefully built layers, without the version you created for the outside world, you can't return to pretending they don't know. And that is where this became complicated. Because you didn't just notice the things I showed you, you noticed the things I didn't, the pauses before I answered, the moments where I pulled back, the thoughts behind the words, the meaning hidden underneath what looked simple. You paid attention in a way that didn't feel invasive. It felt accurate. And accuracy is rare. Most people don't see someone. They see their own idea of someone. They fill the empty spaces with assumptions. They create a version that makes sense to them. But you didn't do that. You allowed the empty spaces to remain empty until I filled them myself. You didn't rush to define me. You didn't force a story onto me. You just allowed me to exist. And somehow, that was more powerful than anything else, because acceptance is easy when someone only sees the parts they like, but acceptance after seeing the complexity, that means something different. It means someone has noticed the contradictions, the quiet moments, the difficult edges, the parts that don't always make sense. And instead of stepping away, they stayed. That was the part I wasn't prepared for. Because I built my world around the idea that closeness comes with a cost. That eventually people ask for more than you can give. That eventually they misunderstand something and turn it into something it was never meant to be. So I learned to stay careful, to keep things controlled, to never let someone become too important before I knew exactly where they stood. But somehow, you bypassed all of that, not by pushing, not by demanding, by simply being consistent. And consistency has a way of reaching places that intensity never can. It doesn't break walls. It makes you question why the walls were there. And that question stayed with me. Because maybe the hardest part wasn't that you saw me. Maybe the hardest part was realizing Abe didn't want to hide anymore. I used to believe distance was the safest place. A place where nothing could reach too deeply, where nothing could disrupt the balance I had created, because distance gives you control. You decide what people know. You decide what they see. You decide how much of yourself exists in someone else's world. And for a long time, that worked. It kept things simple. It kept expectations low. It kept me from depending on something I couldn't control. But then you happened, and slowly, without any dramatic moment, distance started losing its purpose. Because what do you do when someone already understands the parts you were trying to keep protected? What do you do when someone feels close without asking for closeness? When someone reaches a place you never invited them into, somehow they don't feel like an intruder. That was the part I couldn't explain. You weren't taking space, you were creating it. A space where I didn't have to defend every thought, where I didn't have to measure every reaction, where I didn't have to constantly decide what version of myself was safe to show. And that was unfamiliar because I was used to being understood after explaining myself. But with you, AB felt understood before explanation. And that changes the entire dynamic, because when someone understands the surface, you can still hide underneath. But when someone understands the silence, there is nowhere left to disappear. You made me aware of things I had ignored, the way I naturally responded around you, the way my mind became quieter instead of more guarded, the way I stopped preparing for misunderstanding. That's when I realized something. Maybe I wasn't protecting myself from people. Maybe I was protecting myself from the possibility of finally being seen, because being seen means something can matter. And things that matter have the ability to affect you. That has always been the risk. Not losing someone, not even being hurt. The real risk is allowing something to become important enough that its presence changes you. And somehow that was already happening. You weren't changing who I was. You weren't replacing anything. You were simply becoming part of the way I experienced things. A thought I considered, a perspective I valued, a presence I noticed, even in absence. And that was the moment I understood why this felt different. Because you didn't become important through effort. You became important through alignment. Through the quiet realization that some people don't enter your life by making noise. Some people arrive, and everything inside you becomes aware that something has shifted. And once you notice that shift, you can't honestly pretend it never happened. The hardest thing to admit is not that something changed. It's admitting that I allowed it to change. Because I've always been careful about what reaches me, what stays, what becomes important. I don't let things settle easily. I question them. I examine them. I search for the reason behind them before I give them a place in my life. That's how I've always survived. Understanding gives me control, distance gives me safety. But this didn't arrive through logic. It didn't come with an explanation I could analyze. It didn't ask for permission. It simply became present. And the strange part is, AB never truly fought it. I thought I would. I expected myself to create the same distance I always create, to step back, to find the reason why it shouldn't matter, to convince myself that everything has a limit. But every time I tried to reduce it into something smaller, this didn't fit. Because some things cannot be simplified without losing what makes them real. And this felt real. Not because it was perfect, not because it was easy, but because it didn't require pretending. With you, I didn't feel like I had to become more understandable. I didn't have to make myself smaller so someone could handle me. I didn't have to explain every silence, every thought, every contradiction. You didn't ask me to be different. You just recognized me as I was. And that kind of acceptance is rare. Because most people accept the version of you that makes sense to them, the version that fits their expectations. But you seem to accept the parts that didn't fit the unfinished thoughts, the complicated emotions, the moments where I didn't even fully understand myself. And that made something inside me loosen. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough. Enough for me to realize that maybe control isn't always protection. Sometimes control is just a wall that stays standing long after the danger is gone. And maybe that's why this feels unfamiliar. Because I'm not used to something reaching me without taking anything from me. I'm not used to someone being close without making me feel trapped. I'm not used to being understood without having to earn it. And now I'm left with a truth I can't ignore. Some part of me already accepted this before I named it, before I understood it, before I decided what it meant. It happened quietly. In the way I stopped questioning your presence, in the way I allowed this connection to exist without trying to control its outcome. In the way I realized that maybe not everything meaningful needs to be held tightly. Maybe some things are protected not by distance, but by allowing them to exist.